is Hello everyone, my name is Cass Casmus and I'm a cadet in the Jayhawk Battalion here at KU Army ROTC. I'm also a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics and thank you for attending today's program presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come around with the microphone so you can ask your question. Please stand if you're able and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones at this time. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Kalick, the Director of the Department of Military History.
He is also the author of The School of Hard Knocks, Combat Leadership in the American Expeditionary Forces, which was a Society of Military History Distinguished Book Award. He also wrote Pershing's Crusaders, American Soldiers in World War I, and that one also received 2 different awards. So today he's going to talk about something outside his comfort zone, not World War I. He's going to talk about George Washington and Whiskey Rebellion. So without further ado, Sean Faulkner.
Outside my comfort zone. Hey, it is always a pleasure to speak here at the Dole Center. The folks do a bang-up job of setting it up, and we always have a good crowd here, too. This year's theme for the Fort Leavenworth Lecture Series is World Leaders in Wartime. And you'll notice my theme sort of departs for that. And there's a reason for it. If you are a federal employee or an official, generally you're going to take an oath to uphold and defend the constitutions against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And while my learned comrades are really talking about leaders dealing with enemies foreign, today I'm going to talk about dealing with enemies domestic, specifically how the Washington administration dealt with the crisis of the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, I think this is an important topic for a couple of reasons. First of all, I was told if I talked about whiskey, all the day tipplers from Lawrence would show up. And guess what? That's proven to be the case. I'm just saying, not judging. Also, Dr. Kalick failed to mention that in celebration of the Whiskey Rebellion, he is buying everybody a shot after the lecture. Okay? All kidding aside, Washington's performance in the Whiskey Rebellion was as important as anything he did in the American Revolution, really establishing the foundation of the republic that we have today. Now, I teach an elective on the history of Homeland Security at Fort Leavenworth, and that's basically a history of the use of military forces domestically. And I like to tell the students on the first day of class that their form of government today under the Constitution is largely the product of enemies domestic. Only 3 years after the end of the American Revolution, disgruntled farmers and Revolutionary War veterans in western Massachusetts rose up, shut down courts, intimidated officials, and ultimately planned to seize the federal arsenal in Springfield. Now, while the government of Massachusetts ultimately put down what would become known as Shays' Rebellion, it shook the foundations of the republic. And you see from that little quote from George Washington, it scared the founders that there was so much discontent, so much tension within the republic. The fear was we're on the brink of anarchy or dissolution. It also laid bare the absolute powerlessness of the central government under the Articles of Confederation. So in 1787, delegates converged on Philadelphia to basically rewrite the foundation of the republic. Now, the founders are smart enough to realize that given the expanse of the republic and the multiplicity of interests from different groups, there were bound to be social, political, and economic tensions that were going to lead to violence from time to time in the republic. So they wrote into the Constitution articles that would prepare the president, give the president power to deal with these, both enemies foreign, but also enemies domestic. And these are the articles in the Constitution that are the foundation for putting American soldiers' boots on American streets. Now, while the Constitution is, of course, the supreme law of the land, it's not a law at all. The Congress then had to make legislation to put the Constitution into effect. It can probably tell you something about their mindset that one of the first major pieces of legislation that the first Congress passed was this, the Calling Forth Act. The Calling Forth Act allowed the government to bring in militia to deal with enemies foreign, but it also talked at length about enemies domestic. And there he gave the president two different courses that he could pursue to put boots on American streets. And with very few changes and only a few additions, these remain the fundamental foundations for doing that to this day. The first one I like to call the vampire clause, based on the argument that, if you're going to have a vampire, he can't come into your house unless you invite him in. So the first one allows the state legislature, or the governor if the legislature is not in session, to declare that there is an internal insurrection in the state that they can't put down and to ask for the federal assistance to deal with the crisis. The second one, and the one that's most germane to today's lecture, is that second part. That whenever the laws of the United States, the federal laws of the United States, are opposed in the execution thereof or obstructed by any state or any group within a state that is too powerful to be put down through the normal course of judicial proceedings, it is the president's right, in fact, his obligation to see that the laws are well and faithfully executed. And they can call out the militia to do so. In either case, though, before the president can send, those military jackbooted thugs onto your streets, he has to issue a proclamation that tells the citizenry to return peacefully back to their abodes. In English common law, this is called the Riot Act. Have you ever heard reading the Riot Act? That's where it comes from. So we now have that established. But let's lay the foundation for the tensions that are going on in American society that are going to contribute to this coming to a head in western Pennsylvania. The new republic is beset by a host of foreign and domestic problems. We'll start with the foreign. As you can tell from this map of the new republic, the new nation is confronted with three major and powerful opponents. The first of which are the British. They're still smarting a bit from that whole American Revolution. In fact, the minute that we win the American Revolution, the British close most of their trade with the new United States, which is going to have a detrimental effect on our economy. The Brits are also refusing to give up ports that they've occupied in what will become known as the Old Northwest that are legally in the United States due to the treaty. In addition to that, they're using these forts as springboards to provide support to Native American tribes who are attacking the white American settlers moving in the trans-Appalachian West. Which brings us to the next group. Hey, if you're a Native American, you've seen the handwriting on the wall since 1607. And in 1786, just a few years after the American Revolution, the Shawnee, the Potawatomi, the Miami, the Delaware, those names might sound familiar if you're from Kansas, and a host of other Native American tribes band together to form a confederation under the titular leadership of Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. And what their goal is to stop this train from moving before the white settlement gets going too fast. In fact, between 1786 and 1790, Native American attacks kill, wound, or carry off 1,500 Americans, at least 1,500 Americans. And if you're living in the trans-Appalachian West, your belief is the people in the east of the mountains could care less about your safety. Now, that's going to be a backdrop against this Whiskey Rebellion. Now, the new Washington administration is going to try to deal with this, and he'll ultimately send 3 expeditions to deal with the Confederacy. 2 of them are disasters. In fact, the expedition led by Arthur St. Clair in 1791 is still the worst defeat at the hands of Native Americans by the federal government throughout the nation's history. It makes, Custer's Last Stand look like meh. The third one, though, under Revolutionary War hero Bad Anthony Wayne and the American Legion, will ultimately defeat the Confederation at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August of 1794. And that's right in the midst of the Whiskey Rebellion lighting fire. The last major power were the Spanish. Like the Native Americans, the Spanish see the handwritings on the wall. And even though they were our allies in the American Revolution, in 1784, they cut off all American trade down the Mississippi River and New Orleans. Now, this is basically going to cripple the economy of the trans-Appalachian West. We'll talk about that here in a couple of minutes. But they're not just content to do that. They also are now sending representatives out into Kentucky and Tennessee and the forks of the Ohio to encourage the settlers there who are discontented with the leadership in the East to secede and join the Spanish Empire. Now, they are aided in this endeavor by this guy, James Wilkinson, the second-ranking Army officer in the United States. Wilkinson is also a Spanish spy, and he will receive over $1 million in today's money to not only inform the Spanish what the American government is up to, but also to encourage the good Kentuckians to secede. He is one of the greatest unhung traitors in American history, okay? Now, things are sort of, that's not tense enough. In 1789, of course, the French go into revolution. And as that revolution starts to build strength, and as the wars of the French Revolution start to begin, both the French and the British want the United States to pick their side. And we want to remain neutral for a host of reasons. The Americans will proclaim our right to freedom of the seas, to trade with whoever we want, at which time the British say that's fine, start seizing American ships and taking American sailors. The French are not far behind. Believe it or not, they want to influence American elections. And so the new French ambassador, citizen Charles Genet, will land and automatically start to build up opposition to the Washington administration. And he will actually go so far as to kit out French privateers in American ports, opposing Wilson's neutrality proclamation. Oh, if we don't like Wilkinson, we also have George Rogers Clark, another American revolutionary hero. But he's set on hard times. Genet commissions him as a French general and gives him the mission of leading a filibuster expedition to recapture Spanish Louisiana for the French. And he is only thwarted by Mad Anthony Wayne on the instructions of Washington to cease the filibustering campaign. So all that international backdrop is going to cause tension. Equally troubling is what's going on domestically. When the new administration comes into office, the bottom is out of the tub. The federal government is bankrupt. Most of the state governments are bankrupt. In addition to that, the population of the new republic is booming. In fact, of the 4 southwestern counties that will be the center point of the Whiskey Rebellion, the population of those counties had risen by 85% between 1786 and 1790, which again puts more and more economic pressure in the region. Now, the Republic also has a number of disgruntled Revolutionary War veterans who rightly believe that they have been screwed over by an uncaring state and federal governmental system. Now, when the war ends in 1783, the government just decides they're going to demobilize the troops. The problem is the troops are owed a lot of back pay and bonuses for their service. Government has no money, so what they do is give the soldiers basically worthless federal bonds. Now, the soldiers, if you're in the Newburgh Cantonment outside of West Point, you need traveling around money to get back home. Right outside the gates of the cantonment, there are a number of speculators that are happy to take your bonds for pennies on the dollar, generally a depreciation of 15 to 25% of face value, to give you enough money to leave. Now, those Revolutionary War veterans are also irritated because a number of their states had given them land bounties in return for service. They didn't read the fine print. All of those land bounties were west of the Appalachian Mountains and territory, let's just say, owned by somebody else who wasn't happy to have you be there. Now, when the veterans and other settlers now try to get their equality of opportunity west of the mountains, what they find is Eastern speculators had swept in and bought up 35 to 45% of the best land tracts. The veterans have to take out loans just to get farming started. Those speculators, though, are happy to lease them the land. Oh, once they often clear the land and start planting the land, the absentee landlord shows back up with a please vacate notice. See, you're starting to get angry. Good, that's good. We need a little anger here. So as you can see, these tensions are building, and it doesn't help that the founders can't live up to the founders' own promise. None of the founders during the American Revolution want to have anything to do with political parties. That's like evil, old, icky Britain stuff. And yet within 2 years of the establishment of the Republic, guess what? We have political parties. There's just too many multiplicity of interests going around in the Republic to have that not occur. And so domestically, you also start to see deep partisan divisions. Some things never change. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? On one hand, you've got the Federalist, best exemplified by Alexander Hamilton. On the other hand, you've got the Democratic Republicans, exemplified by Thomas Jefferson. The problem is these guys can't agree on anything. And what they fundamentally disagree on is what the new republic should look like. If you are Hamilton and the Federalist, you want a strong central government that has the military power to defend against enemies, foreign and domestic, but also an economic agenda that is based upon building America as a manufacturing and commercial hub. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, start with the idea that a small government is what you need. As Jefferson will say, the government that governs best governs least. And the government or the nation that you should have, socially, politically, and economically, is built along small, virtuous, agriculturally based landowners. That only then could the republic stay together. And as we start to go into this Whiskey Rebellion, you're going to see those partisan divides start to color how both sides view the issue. The issue you can't get around is the money is out of the tub. Both Washington and Hamilton realized that the first thing that must be done in the new republic is to put us back on a firm financial basis. When the new government comes into power, the federal government is $56 million in the hole for Revolutionary War debt. We should have such problems today, right? And the states were $25 million in debt due to the American Revolution. Until you could get the faith and confidence in American credit and the economy, the faith that the American government could pay its bills, nobody was going to invest in the Republic, and we would stagnate. Because of the loss of trade, we were already in a recession that had lasted or would last the first decade of the Republic's existence. So to climb out of that hole, Hamilton and his friend, Robert Morris, one of the wealthiest men in America, come up with a plan. It's called funding and assumption. The first part is assumption. The new federal government would assume all of the federal and state war debts. They include the states because the new economy could only be as strong as its weakest link. If you left the states out, the economy would still fall apart. Now, here's how funding worked. Remember all those worthless bonds? All those worthless bills from the American Revolution? Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, is going to give you 100% face value of whatever those bonds say. Oh, if you had a federal or state bond, in addition to your 100% face value, you also receive 6% interest on those loans. Now, keep in mind that the speculators had been buying up those things for pennies on the dollar, sometimes 100 to 500% depredation of what was at the face value. Now, probably shouldn't surprise us that the minute that looks like this plan is going to succeed, Robert Morris and a bunch of the other insider trading Eastern speculators send agents around to buy up every little scrap of debt that they can. And when this passes, these guys make a killing. But now we got to talk about the other side. We've got the assumption, but now comes the rub, the funding. To fund this plan, Hamilton jumps on a sin tax. Let's put a duty under the Excise Act of 1791 on all spirituous liquors, all distilled alcohol. Now, this is the way it's supposed to work. You could either pay 9 to 15% tax on every gallon that you produce based upon the proof of the product, or you could pay in volume for the production capacity of your still. Okay, 60 cents per gallon. So if you had a 10-gallon still, you would owe the government $6 every year. Now, if you are a small producer, like those people generally west of the Appalachian Mountains, you generally chose the per gallon rate because you're only producing in the summer and fall. So you're not a year-round producer. The large distillers, who are mostly in the east, who can produce at volume and can produce year-round, tend to choose the overall production cost on their stills. Okay? And by doing that, since you're doing it at bulk and volume, what that really meant is that you were lowering the tax to about 6 cents per gallon. And when the Revenue Act was amended the year later, it actually dropped the cost for big distillers down to about 1/6 of a cent per gallon. Now, if you're a big producer, you love this because it means that you can undercut all the small producers. Now, this, of course, is going to create some problems because this is taxation, and the Americans didn't like taxation. That's that whole American Revolution thing coming back out. And so Hamilton brought out the big guns, and for the first time in American history, he brought in scientific experts to pass bills. He turned to Benjamin Rush, one of the most noted physicians in America at the time, and the Philadelphia College of Physicians to come in before Congress and certify that whiskey drinking's bad for you. Which led for the first time in history, the legislators saying, I'm not following the science, get your nose out of my business. So, the excise passed, but the minute that the excise passed, opposition to it raised all along the Appalachian West. We tend to think about this as being a Pennsylvania problem, but there is opposition, violent opposition to the excise from the mountains of South Carolina to the north direction, to the New York border. But the central part of the resistance are these 4 counties in Pennsylvania, the 4th survey. Now, it probably helped the fact that between 15 to 25% of all of the stills in America were in these 4 counties. Now, I'm not going to say anything about the drinking capacity of the people from this part of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but if you've ever seen Steelers fans, I'll just let it go as that. Now, they're opposing this tax for some very serious reasons, most of which is geographic. The transportation infrastructures, and you can see the terrain, the topography here, going from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia is horrible. It's just underdeveloped, underfunded. What they're producing in these regions is wheat, barley, rye, and corn. All of these crops are heavy and bulky if you're trying to take them to market across these mountains. In fact, it cost more to ship a ton of goods 100 miles over the Appalachian Mountains than it did to ship a ton of goods from London to Philadelphia. Now, what made sense to them is to take all of that grain, that heavy, hard-to-transport grain. I can either get 24 bushels and require 3 mules, or I can take all that grain and distill it into sweet, sweet whiskey. Not only would it be easier to transport, but more importantly, you're going to get more money out of it on the other end. So this excise tax to you is not a sin tax, it's a direct income tax in a nation that does not have a direct income tax. And if this starts to smell like the no taxation without representation, that's exactly how it felt to these farmers. They were also irritated by the way this tax was going to be implemented. that federal revenue agents would enter your property, they would register and brand your stills, they would test the proof of your product, and then issue you a tax certificate. Without the tax certificate, it was illegal to sell or move your whiskey. Oh, at the time that the still was registered, you had to pay the tax in hard cash. Now, this is a region that's still basically on a barter economy and doesn't have a lot of specie. They're also not happy about the other side of the tax man. The tax man who believes that you might have an illicit still shows up in your property, ransacks your stuff. If he finds your illegal still, they destroy it, they confiscate any whiskey on the premises, and then turn you over to the federal marshal to appear before the federal judge. Oh, the federal judge is in Philadelphia, 300 miles away. And if you're a farmer, think about how long it's going to take you just to get to Philadelphia, and then cool your jets for no telling how many weeks before you can appear before the judge, and then make your way back. Now, there's something in the Declaration of Independence about George III transporting people far away for trial. These are Revolutionary War guys. These guys have a memory of what had occurred here. So if you are a Western Pennsylvania farmer, you believe that the federal government is deliberately screwing you over for the benefit of the Eastern speculators. And you believe this because the federal government is deliberately screwing you over for the benefit of the Eastern speculators. Now, most of the ire of these guys is going to fall on him, John Neville. Now, he is a Revolutionary War general. He is also one of the wealthiest landowners in the region. And by intermarriage with a bunch of the other elite families of the 4th District, his family has a stranglehold on the social, political, and economic life of the region. He himself owns a 600-gallon capacity distillery. Because he's producing year-round at volume, he manages to get a stranglehold on the sale of whiskey to the U.S. Army. And if you've ever been around soldiers, you know how big of a deal that is, right? It doesn't hurt the fact that his son-in-law is a regular Army quartermaster officer at the American Fort in Pittsburgh who is doing the buying for the American Army. What is really irritating people is the fact that after being against the excise tax, he turns around and accepts the position of the supervisor of the excise in the 4th District. Oh, that comes with a $450 a year salary, when the average salary in the United States throughout the 1790s is $65 a year. Oh, he also gets a 1% take of every tax dollar he brings in. He, of course, has to turn around and hire other excise men who, in turn, also receive a 1% kickback for all the taxes they collect. You want to talk about some motivated federal employees. These guys feel like they've been left behind. And soon, discontentment is going to lead to action, both legal action and less than legal action. Beginning in late August of 1791, all of the representatives from the counties hold elections, and then they send delegates to this assembly in Pittsburgh. Now, as we're going to see throughout this crisis, there's going to be a constant debate between the hardliners who want a lot more vigorous action against the excise and the moderates. In this first meeting, the moderates under Hugh Breckinridge actually win They choose a moderate route. Let us use our representatives to petition both the state and the federal legislatures for redress of the excise. And they send William Finley, their congressman, back to Philadelphia to do the wrangling. Unfortunately, Finley gets very little headway. It comes down to demographics. There are simply a lot more people living east of the mountains, so they have more representatives, and too many of those representatives are closely tied to the money class. So they're not getting anywhere on the legal front. While that's going away, there's going to be less than legal stuff going on. On the 11th of September, 1791, a mob of 14 disgruntled farmers waylay the tax collector Robert Johnson. Johnson is stripped naked, whipped, and then tarred and feathered. Now, if you don't know anything about tarring and feathering, you take nearly boiling pitch and you apply it to the naked body. In the process, you'll receive second or third degree burns, if not worse. You will then be doused in a fine collection of chicken feathers. Now, this is for two reasons. One, of course, it makes it harder to get the pitch off, but it also makes you a figure of scorn. And the message that they're sending here, of course, is stop being a revenue agent. Now, basically because of this opposition, the federal government makes no money off the tax through most of 1791. And when John Neville tries to resume the collection of taxes in 1792, things get a little bit uglier. There's going to be a second Pittsburgh assembly, but this time the hardliners take control. David Bradford, Benjamin Parkinson, and John Hamilton. They are joined by this guy, Herman Husband. He's a millennialist preacher, an evangelical millennialist preacher who believes that violent opposition to the excise tax will actually help to usher in the second coming. Who said things are logical? Albert Gallatin, who is a remaining sort of moderate in this area, is simply outvoted. We'll see him come back a little bit later. Now, this new Mingo Creek Association of the hardliners starts to lay down the law. They're not politely asking the federal government for redress anymore. They're now making demands. First of all, they demand the end of the excise tax with a replacement on a tax on wealth. Take that, speculators. They also demand that Neville be removed and not replaced. They start committees of correspondence, just like in the American Revolution, and start talking about how to coordinate their actions. They're also now willing to use a mite bit of violent suasion to get people in line. And this is led by this amorphous figure called Tom the Tinker. And so if you are not supporting, or if you are tacitly supporting the excise by giving a tax man a place to sleep, or by registering your still and paying your taxes, Tom the Tinker leaves a letter on your door. If you're familiar with the night letters from Iraq and Afghanistan, same idea. And it's basically, I know who you are, I know where you live, and I know what you did last summer. And if you don't cease and desist, you will see me again. And if you continue to tacitly support the excise tax, then in the middle of the night, somebody's going to show up at your house. They're going to destroy your still, break your farm implements, cripple your livestock, and burn down your barn. This is seen in the example of William Faulkner. No relation. Okay? William Faulkner had leased out part of his inn so Neville could establish an excise office. When he establishes this inn, a group of concerned citizens shows up and says, "Hey, Bill, why don't you give that up? We don't like it." Now, Faulkners are known to be sort of dumb, okay, and stubborn. And so he said, "No, I'm not going to do it. I'm making money off of this." So a couple days later, masked riders show up outside the inn, circle the place, firing in the air, and then riddling the portrait of George Washington that is hanging as a sign outside the inn. We're used to George sort of being popular. Like most Faulkners, he's slow. Finally, the mob shows up and ransacks the inn. Fortunately for William Faulkner, he is not at home, or he would have been tarred and feathered. Then finally, the thick-headed Faulkners get the message and cease working here. Now, if you're George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, you're a mite bit perturbed by this. The excise, the federal law is not being enforced. Yeah. Federal agents have been attacked violently. Which brings me to Alexander Hamilton. Before he became a singing and dancing Puerto Rican star, he was the first Secretary of the Treasury. He wants a hard line taken early and often. If the government is to have respect, if the government is not to go the way of the powerless Articles of Confederation, the government must make its law writ throughout the land. And so in the very beginning here in 1792, he's telling Washington, go hard, go violent, end it. Oftentimes, historians believe or have argued that Washington and Hamilton were like this, joined at the hip when it came to the Whiskey Rebellion, or worse yet, Hamilton was leading Washington by the nose. Nothing could be further from the truth. Washington understood the stakes involved, that federal law had to be written, but at the same time, he also understood that once you crossed that boundary into governmental violence, there was no going back. He holds conferences with his cabinet to decide what to do. Unfortunately, those ideological splits are evident in his cabinet. On one hand, you've got Hamilton and the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, who want the hard line. On the other hand, you've got Jefferson, who can't agree with Hamilton on anything, who say, come on, let's be honest. These rebels are justified in their actions. And oh, by the way, this crisis was made by mistakes of Alexander Hamilton. Let's not take any action at all and see what happens. The coolest head is Attorney General Edmund Randolph. Now, before Washington wants to do anything, he wants to make sure he's on firm legal and constitutional grounds. And when he consults Randolph, Randolph says, first of all, let's be clear. Based upon the actual reports we're hearing, this is not yet a conspiracy. There may be individuals who have done a legal act, but it does not cross the path into insurrection. Let's go slow. Make sure that all the stones are crossed before we go ahead. Hamilton persists. No, we need to take the hard line, to the point that Washington actually has to put him in his place. Again, I teach a history of Homeland Security, and by the time we're done throughout the elective, the students establish the 4 ugly rules of putting boots on American streets. The first reality, or the first rule is, if American boots are on American streets, something has gone horribly wrong in the Republic. The second reality is, no matter how legal your justification is for going in, no matter how benign your desire to do good is, when you arrive on American streets, you're pissing somebody off. And the longer you're there, the more irritation grows. And because of that second rule, the third rule comes into play, that the minute that you put boots on American streets, you are going to create a political crisis. You're going to create political trouble for yourself or others. But most importantly is the fourth rule, that the minute that you put American boots on American street, there is a distinct possibility that American soldiers are going to shoot American citizens in the face. George Washington never took my class. But George Washington instinctively understood this reality. Yes, we must make sure that federal laws are in place, but any use of violence must be the last resort. The Boston Massacre is still within living memory. He refuses to accede to Hamilton's desire to use the regular army. Look, we have a fear of standing armies. If we do this, the cat is out of the bag. Everybody knows it. And the Militia Calling Forth Act sort of says you got to use the militia, but this also puts him in a bind. Now, the founders wanted to use the militia for this mission for the simple reason that a free people will not willingly impose tyranny upon themselves. And as the militia is made up of we the people, you got a challenge. If you call out the militia, they may be sympathetic to the rebels. They may not show up, or worse yet, when they show up, they may join the other side. So again, this is giving Washington pause when it comes to using force. But that does not mean he's inert. As he tells Thomas Jefferson, doing nothing is not an option. And I know whatever I do is going to be politically controversial, but I don't care. I got to do my job. He takes the first step, issuing the Riot Act, warning the people of Pennsylvania that if you don't adhere back to the federal laws, the next thing's going to happen soon after. Unfortunately, Mother Nature intervenes. Yellow fever hits the capital at Philadelphia. Over 10% of the population of the city will die during this epidemic. Now, George Washington and most of the other federal officials flee. Washington goes back to Mount Vernon. And because of the federal government leaving the capital, federal business basically shuts down for over 4 months. Hamilton himself nearly dies from the disease. But if you're a farmer or a rebel in western Pennsylvania, when Washington doesn't follow up with his proclamation, you believe that the federal government lacks the internal fortitude to actually take the next step. But in 1794, everything is going to start to fall apart. The Rubicon will be passed. Hamilton and the judicial system will now issue 75 summonses for all of those scofflaws who had refused to pay the excise. And they turn to David Lennox, the U.S. Marshal, to issue out those summonses. Now, Marshall, of course, is aided by our friend John Neville, who is happy to take them directly to the door of all the scofflaws. This is going to be the spark. It starts when Lennox and Neville show up at the farm of William Miller. Now, Miller is trying to bring in the crop. He's frantically working. If you know farmers, frantically working in the summer to bring in the crop. When these guys are assaulting him inside of his own property, assailing him, and he just goes off on them. He is an angry man, and in fact, he was not a rebel. He did not support opposing the excise through violence. But now, the rest of his neighbors start to see what's going on. And the minute that Lennox and Neville are leaving the farm, they're being pursued by a party of 40 angry men who are firing at them as they're retreating. When they make their escape the next day, a group of 30 rebel militia show up at Neville's Bower Hill home, demanding Neville's surrender and giving up of the job. Now, there's going to be a gunfight that follows. It'll kill 1 rebel and wound 5 more. Neville will manage to hold the attackers at bay, but only by arming his slaves, which again infuriates a number of the rebels. Now, while Neville is successful that day, the very next day, 500 militiamen show up at his house. Fortunately for Neville, he had gotten the message and was hiding out in the countryside, leaving behind his regular army son-in-law and a small squad of regular army soldiers to hold the property. When the rebels show up, the rebel leader goes forward with a flag of truce to do a parley to end this without bloodshed. Unfortunately, somebody in the house fires and kills him, thus infuriating, as you can imagine, the militiamen, who immediately start to burn all of the outbuildings and threaten to burn down the house around their heads if the people inside don't surrender. The minute that they come out, of course, they burn the home too. While that's going on, a second party of militiamen managed to capture Lennox, one of Neville's sons, and another regular army officer. They hold them overnight and ultimately release Lennox only after he surrenders the remaining summonses he has in his satchel and promises to leave the area. Shortly thereafter, there's going to be another meeting at Mingo Church. And again, the hardliners are driving the train, to the fact that the head hardliner, David Bradford, will take on the responsibilities of the governor of Pennsylvania upon himself and call out the region's militia. And over 7,000 rebel militiamen will show up at Braddock's Field. If you're the Washington administration, woo-wee, things have gotten a mighty bit complicated. Federal officials have been fired on. American soldiers have been fired on. The property of officials have been fired on. These guys have now stopped and searched the mail to see if anybody is corresponding with the revenue agents. Oh, and by the way, it seems like they're forming their own army to subvert the government. Washington will call an emergency meeting on the 1st and 2nd of August to try to deal with the crisis. For the first time, he invites Pennsylvania Governor Mifflin to the proceedings. Anybody want to guess what Alexander Hamilton has to say when he shows up? Let me shoot somebody. Right? It's time to go with a hard line. Governor Mifflin, however, is a Democratic Republican. He has been in ideological opposition to the Federalists for a long time. In fact, he and George have an ugly history. Washington had relieved him as being the quartermaster chief of the Continental Army, and Mifflin had been involved in the convoy cabal that had sought to replace Washington as the commander of the Continental Army in 1776. So these guys have history. What Mifflin's saying is, I sort of sympathize with the rebels. You have brought this federal problem to me and asked me to help you. Why should I do so? If I call out my militia, first of all, I got to go to my legislature and get their approval. And oh, by the way, I'm not certain that my militia will turn out to support you. Washington also wants to make sure that he's on firm legal ground. This is what really sets precedent here. Washington knows everything he does is setting precedent for presidents going to come after him. He wants to make sure that every T is crossed and every I is dotted before he sends in the troops. The Calling Forth Act requires that there is a certification by a federal district judge of the breakdown in law order that cannot be resumed by the normal course of judicial proceedings. He doesn't go to any federal district court. He goes to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and says, can you certify that there's a breakdown here? Again, though, in the midst of this, Edmund Randolph is the voice of reason. And one of the most poignant and well-written sort of summaries of events, this is what he sends to Washington. First of all, I'm not so sure the Supreme Court justice has adequately looked at the legality of this. So I'm not sure that we're on full ground. But what I can tell you is we're on a course that's going to lead to bloodshed. All I am saying is give peace a chance. He said that long before, John Lennon. I'm just saying. And the idea here is let us send a peace commission to the rebel areas. Give them the ability to issue broad amnesties for any actions they did, except for the worst violent offenders, and see if we can end this without bloodshed. This, of course, appealed to Governor Mifflin. Washington ultimately decided to take a middle course. On one hand, he's going to get and send 3 peace commissioners to southwest Pennsylvania. Simultaneously, he's going to tell the Secretary of War to send notifications to the states of Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia to prepare their militia for action. And he will also reissue the Riot Act. Now, things are going to start to move very quick here. The peace commissioners are trying to get to Parkinson's Ferry, which is going to be the site of another assembly, before the 14th of August to try to head things off. All of these guys, though, are Federalist. They have absolutely no sympathy for the rebels. In fact, from the moment that they start their journey west, they're sending back a constant stream of negative reports to Washington about the intransigence of the people in the area. When they reach Parkinson Ferry, they've realized things have changed. The moderates have again managed to wrestle control of the narrative. The fact that Washington has started to call out the militia had rattled the Forks. And now Breckinridge and Gallatin and even Herman Husband had joined the moderate groups. All of the delegates drawn from the region would vote on whether or not to accept Washington's turn. At the end, 34 voted in favor of supporting Washington, 23 opposed. But what the peace commissioners reported are, yeah, I got it, maybe the majority are going along with this, but a powerful and violent minority still want to oppose the government. So Washington ultimately will start to mobilize to deal with this. And they will give command of this new army to Henry Lee, Light Horse Harry, the father of Robert E. Lee, by the way. He is the governor of Virginia, temporarily lays that aside to command the several militia. Washington will actually accompany the army to Carlisle and a little bit beyond. When he gets to Carlisle, he is met by this delegation of William Finley and David Reddick. They've been sent by the people of the Forks to try to stop the movement of the army. And what he tells Washington, what they tell Washington is, all resistance has collapsed. The hotheads have already left for points west. They know what's coming. 2 American citizens had already been killed by the militia forces. And because the logistics arrangements had already fallen apart, the troops had already started to plunder the locals just to have something to eat. So let's stop this before it gets out of control. Washington, though, says, look, we've already spent a lot of time and money to bring this army together, and you're giving me the hope for, maybe, possible peace of the area. I can't go on that. But what he does is issues the decree that says, if we go into the area, when we go into this area, everybody will be treated under the color of law, and only those who do violent opposition to the federal forces have anything to fear from us. On the 21st of October, though, Washington leaves and goes back to the capital, leaving Alexander Hamilton behind as his political representative. And when Lee's army descends upon the forts, they act as an army of occupation. They will start to round up anyone suspected of participating in the political process and any militiamen that they can lay their hand on that showed up at Braddock's Field. Those who are arrested are generally kept in horrible condition. 22 of them will ultimately be force-marched to Philadelphia in very poor weather. But in the end, of the 22 that they actually arraigned for sedition or treason, only 2 were convicted. The first 2 in American history, by the way, convicted of treason. But Washington, again, will show his magnanimity and will ultimately pardon them, keep them from going to the hangman's noose. In the end, though, Washington wants to keep a lid on this. And when he starts to hear of the depredations of the army, once Lee goes back to being the governor, leaving Daniel Morgan behind, this is the missive that he sends in March. Okay, you're not the law unto yourselves. You are just an element, an arm of the law. It's time to return to normalcy. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion is important. Not only does it show and set the trend for the use of military forces domestically from 1794 onward, but it also established the fact that from then on, federal law and the Constitution are writ throughout the land, a reality that we still have today. So, we've talked about the Whiskey Rebellion. Dr. Kellick is getting ready with your shots of whiskey. What are your questions?
Is there really a confrontation?
No. The
Particular battle day?
No, the Whiskey Rebellion is not. The Whiskey Rebellion dies in a whimper, not a bang. That the show of force that comes in, and probably the fact that the Fed forces do come in pretty hard, means that there's really no violent opposition to the Army when it comes in. Alexander Hamilton is the one that actually called this the Whiskey Rebellion. Is it really a rebellion? Is it really an insurgency? I don't know. But if you start to get 700 militiamen armed and together, that sort of looks like an insurgency. But in the end, there's really very little bloodshed except for those 2 civilians that are killed.
In the initial, there was a militiaman that supported the farmers and the...
Oh, yeah.
What was this other group from the other states, the militiamen that came in?
Yeah. Well, again, when the government calls it out, and that's a great question, they mobilize or nationalize, federalize the militia of Pennsylvania, mostly from eastern Pennsylvania, Virginia, New Jersey, and Maryland. Now, Washington is right when it comes to some of his fears here. He initially calls for 15,000 militiamen to put down the rebellion. There is great resistance to doing this in western Maryland and western Virginia. In fact, a number of militia units refuse to muster or mutiny once they're called in. And even after the troops are on the march and mobilized, scores of guys desert in the way. By the time they actually have the army at Carlisle, it's about 10,000 guys, down from 15,000. That being said, that is larger than the American forces that Washington had commanded at Yorktown. So it's a miracle they did it, and it was sort of ugly at times, but it still came off.
Just a reminder to guests that I do have the microphone, so if you would like to answer or ask a question, then I'm here and I will hand you the microphone so everyone can hear you.
Tomas.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. You talk about the politicking going on within Washington's cabinet with Hamilton and Jefferson and so on, and you talk about the politicking in western Pennsylvania among the whiskey rebels. My question is about other prominent political leaders, senators and congressmen at the national level. I guess they'd be in Philadelphia. And governors of other states, if they were following this with interest and felt that they needed to weigh in some way.
Oh yeah, well that's, again, this is the first great partisan divide in American history. And at this point in time, the Federalists sort of have the upper hand when it comes to a lot of the governors. Light Horse Harry Lee is a strong Federalist and a friend of Washington. Mifflin, of course, is a Democratic Republican. And when it comes to the other representatives, they're also split, but at this point in time, the Federalists still have the upper hand, so they're able to push through the legislation. It's sort of amazing that anything gets done, much like today. There will be a price to pay for this, though, that ultimately the Federalists will overplay their hand. We got to keep in mind that this is all occurring against the backdrop of the French Revolution. And as the French Revolution becomes ever more radical and violent, the fear of the Federalists is that's happening here. That Thomas Jefferson is as radical as a Jacobin as Robespierre or anyone else. And again, with Citizen Genet spreading the rumor that there's going to be a fifth column of Democratic Republicans really makes this a boiling pot. And this, under the Adams administration, will ultimately lead to the Alien and Sedition Act, a direct assault on the Constitution, which in turn, of course, will assure the election of Jefferson in 1800 and the rolling back of that stuff. And there's a wholesale purge of the regular army after that. If you were a Federalist, Jefferson starts to kick those guys out. Yeah, fascinating. Some things never change, I guess. So I don't know if that's comforting or not. Good question.
Did the whiskey tax end up achieving its goals in like paying for the debt? And how did they pay for the 15,000 soldiers? And were there any other taxes that the government had to raise?
No. That ultimately, the cost of putting down the rebellion means that the government makes almost no money out of the excise, even after the opposition is crushed. It'll ultimately go away when the Jeffersonians take over. The economy will slowly crawl out of the recession. The federal government will do a couple of treaties, both with the British and the Spanish, that will reopen trade, and so it'll take some of that pressure off. And so the government finds other ways of funding this. And one of the things they turn to is the sale of Western lands. So once you dispossess, under the Treaty of Granville, after the victory of Fallen Timber, once you dispossess the Shawnee and the Delaware and the rest, who will ultimately, sadly, end up in Kansas. That's not a joke on Kansas. The federal government starts to sell all of that land with the territorial acts, and so they're managed to make the money back that way. Good question, though. Excellent question. I must have stunned you guys. Hang on.
Well, that gentleman back there was my question. Was the tax, so the tax went away more or less?
Yeah, it ultimately will sunset, and it never brings in, frankly, any revenue of any importance. I mean, if you're George Washington, he actually has one of the largest distilleries in Virginia. Now, he'll pay the tax for it. As the good people at Mount Vernon will remind you, he'll pay the tax on it. But he makes $6,000 worth of profit every year off the whiskey that he does. And so if you're a big distiller, you're paying the tax. But again, if you're only paying the equivalent of 1/6 of a cent per gallon, you've got to be selling a lot of whiskey to make up the difference. That being said, the Americans are drinking a lot of alcohol. historian. In fact, there's a great book called The Alcoholic Republic, where he basically studies and says that in this period, Americans are drinking on average 30 gallons of heavy freaking alcohol per person per year. So, and in some places, drinking that is better than drinking the water. So, excellent question.
Early on, you talked about George Rogers Clark, and the Frenchman hired him or had him help to spread these rumors.
Yep.
George
It's not just spreading rumors.
Okay.
It's raising forces to take Spanish Florida or Spanish Louisiana and give it back to the French.
Okay. Raising forces from where? Because George Rogers Clark, was he not a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War, or one or the other? Or
He was a hero of the American Revolution. Had conquered a lot of the British forces in Ohio and parts of Kentucky that we'd call today. And so he is trying to raise forces out of all these disgruntled people in Kentucky and Tennessee and the rest. Yeah, and of course, he'll ultimately go on to become, if I'm not mistaken, the first governor of Missouri. So, you know, crime pays. Wilkinson will ultimately become the ranking officer in the U.S. Army, and again, is one of the greatest unsung traitors in American history. In fact, there's a new book on him that just came out called, well, guess what? American Traitor. So get on Amazon. It looks pretty good.
Thank you for a very informative program. As the general was in the middle of his second term, what was his mindset? Like, do you have any insight into his mindset about actually donning the uniform again and heading out into the field? And did he struggle with that?
Oh, absolutely. And this is actually the end of his first administration. And he is hesitant about the second administration. You know, his health is starting to fail. He goes with the Army as far as Bedford, Pennsylvania, before turning back. And so it's becoming harder and harder for him even to mount horses and stay up with the Army as it goes. When he's out of office, there's another scare, the quasi-war with France, where the French are attacking American shipping just like the Brits had done. And John Adams raised a new army to deal with the possibility of that. And he turned to Washington as the only guy with sort of the wassa, the power, to command. And even then, Washington's like, I'm too old. This is beyond me. And it becomes an ugly little wrangling about who's going to command the army. Wilkinson, of course, says, I should be the guy. Alexander Hamilton says he should be the guy. And so in the end, Washington just washes his hands of it, goes back to Mount Vernon, and as the crisis passed, it's the Army's disbanded, much to the discredit of both Hamilton and Wilkinson. So yeah, the longer he's in office, the more he's not enjoying this. The partisan rancor becomes very ugly and very personal. Now, we think of Washington as sort of the marble man, right? The one that everybody loves, but he's making decisions that, again, are irritating the constituents. And so he's a big target, and he finds that very onerous. That, you know, the idea here is the natural aristocracy in America has risen to the top. Why should these plebs be questioning what we're doing? So there's a little bit of that tendency in Washington spirit. But as Thomas Faulkner says, he is the indispensable man of the Republic. He's the indispensable man in the American Revolution. He's the indispensable man with dealing with this crisis here. Good question. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, you can catch me afterwards. You do. Hey, it's been my great pleasure to speak to you tonight. Thank you for coming out.